Welcome, everybody. My name's Ant Parsons. I'm from ALP Synergy Limited, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting this session today all around peat and peatlands. And this is a project that's part of the Nature Smart and Nature Secure projects that we're delivering on behalf of the Natural Environment Research Council, or NERC, which are part of UK Research and Innovation. So the government's research body, if you like, and we're here to try and help more communities connect with nature and the environment. And when we knew we were doing this project, one of the top names on my list was somebody who I've worked with before with NERC in India on a range of other projects. And Sarah and I have just been reminiscing that the last time we were on a live Zoom like this, it was delivering citizen science workshops for Indian researchers and trying to encourage them to engage with nature and with the environment. So it's lovely to be able to introduce Dr. Sarah Cook.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining at lunchtime. I really appreciate it. So I'm Dr. Sarah Cook, and today I'm going to be talking about my favourite topic. So it was very easy for me to pick a topic when Anne asked me to do this. And it's all around peatlands. So I'm going to be sharing with you today some of the work I've been doing for my PhD, what I'm doing now as well, and just give you an overview about how important these ecosystems are. So in terms of my background, I am at the University of Warwick in life sciences, which is predominantly biology related, but I actually consider myself to be an environmental scientist. I'm particularly interested in a whole range of different things, but mainly how we as humans interact with our different ecosystems and how we impact them as a consequence of our interactions. A lot of my work has been based on freshwater ecosystems, particularly how it links to the global carbon cycle. And that's what I'm going to be talking to you mainly about today. But I've also looked at things like plastics in the water, which is a lot of work that I did with Ant when we were in India. Mainly, most of my fieldwork experience has come from Southeast Asia. So this is relating to tropical peatlands, mainly in Borneo, but I've also done work in India and Cambodia as well. So what are peatlands? So our peatland ecosystems are probably, well, they are the most valuable ecosystem when it comes to carbon. So they actually hold more carbon than all of the world's forests put together. And that fact often surprises people because we tend to focus on and think about forests and rainforests being very important in the carbon cycle, which they are. But peatlands actually store double the amount of carbon than these forests do. So when we think about their coverage, they only cover around 3% of the Earth's land surface. So considering how much carbon they store, they're incredibly carbon dense. And because of this, they are really important when it comes to thinking about climate change, and also carbon stocks and being a point of contact in climate mitigation as well and climate adaptation. So what is peat? So peat is partially decomposed organic matter. So that organic matter is mainly plant origin. So that could be fallen leaves, woody debris, anything falling in that environment. They are waterlogged systems. So this means they're anaerobic. So there's basically no oxygen present. And that means that very little microbial activity can take place because of the lack of oxygen. They also have a very high acidity. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But if you were to take a water sample from a tropical peatland or a temperate peatland, it would probably be on a pH level of around 4, and water is around 7. So they're very acidic. They're also incredibly nutrient stressed as well, because of their waterlogged conditions and their high acidity too. When it comes to the media and I guess TV and film, they always get a really bad reputation. So Lord of the Rings, the Dead Marshes would be an example of a peatland. If any of you have seen The Labyrinth, which is one of my favorite films from childhood, The Bog of Eternal Stench, that's also an example of a peatland too. And what I want to do today is basically show you that they are anything but dead, in terms of them as ecosystems. So this is just a diagram to kind of illustrate to you where the carbon within these systems is kept. So if we look at a tropical forest, you have kind of an equal proportion of carbon stored below ground as you do above ground. But when it comes to our wetlands, which a peatland is, most of that carbon is stored below ground. And I think because of that, they're often forgotten about in it when it comes to thinking about how important they are in the carbon cycle, because we don't really see the carbon that's being stored. They form in layers, and they have distinct different kind of layers to them. So we have our anoxic peat layer. So this is the peat that is stored below the water table. And then we have our oxic peat layer, and that is any of the peat stored above the water table that can be basically easily degraded by our microbes. They form at an incredibly slow rate. So it takes a whole year for only a millimeter of peat to form. So this is an example of a peat core that I took when I was out in Malaysia. That peat core is 50 centimeters. So that represents kind of 50 years of accumulation. And so 500 years actually. And it takes 1,000 years for just 1 meter of peat to form. So the peatlands I've worked on range from around 5 to 4 meters in depth. So that's 4 to 5,000 years it's taken for that peatland environment to actually establish itself. So in terms of their coverage, the majority of them are actually found in high latitudes. So America has around 50% of our peatland environments. But what's even cooler about these systems is that in terms of how much carbon they store, it's changed even since I've been studying them. And this is because we keep finding new areas of peatland all the time. So back in 2017, a study revealed a really large expanse of carbon of peatland area in the Congo Basin that had never been found before. And only last year did we find another peatland environment in the Amazon. They radiocarbon dated this peatland as well, and it was found to be 25,000 years old. So it's really cool that there's these systems that we still haven't fully discovered, and even as of last year, we're still finding more. So in the UK, we have three different types of peatlands. Some of these may be familiar to you. So we have our blanket bogs. They tend to be found in our upland regions. We have our raised bogs, and they tend to resemble kind of dome shapes, hence the names of them. And both our blanket bogs and our raised bogs can only get their water from the rain that falls on them. They're not connected to any other form of hydrology. So we call them ombotrophic. But our fens are very different. So anyone who lives near kind of Cambridgeshire area might be familiar with the fens. They're nourished by kind of mineral rich groundwater. So they're actually connected to some other hydrological systems around them. So they don't predominantly rely just on rainfall. And one of the important plant species that you might find in a temperate peatland is our sphagnum mosses. They look a little bit like this. You wouldn't really, you kind of have to see them properly under a microscope to see them in full detail. But they are really important in terms of how they can keep a peatland wet. So they're a little bit like a sponge, and they help to basically soak up excess water and keep those environments really, really moist. And I don't know if anyone makes wreaths at Christmas. I always ask this when I deliver a similar lecture to my undergrad students, and they look at me like I'm crazy when I talk about making Christmas wreaths. But you would probably use sphagnum moss in your wreath ring when you're kind of making that. So just something to think about next Christmas if you're making a wreath. So how do we use our peatlands? Well, in the UK, a surprising statistic is around 40% of UK grown vegetables are actually grown on peatlands, and most of these do come from the fens. So they're a very important environment in terms of agriculture. Globally, 25 million hectares of peatlands are used for agriculture, which represents a huge amount of land. In the UK, we tend to grow things like potatoes, sugar beet as well is grown on them. But these vegetables have a very high carbon cost, and I'll explain a little bit about that later on. But as I said, they have a very high economic value in terms of agriculture. I don't know if anyone here is an avid gardener, but you might have seen back in 2024 a big shift in terms of the branding on compost. So there was a big push to make compost peat free because we were adding peat to compost in a way to basically increase its moisture content without knowing the damage that that actually has on our peatland systems. So now you will see that most compost is peat free, which is really good. Something that they're thinking of doing is adding the sphagnum moss into compost as well to add that element rather than it being the peat itself. So I'm now going to talk to you a little bit about tropical peatlands, which is the ecosystem that I have the most experience working in. So our tropical peatland areas are found over here in kind of Borneo and Malaysia. And although it's a very small area, this particular area houses around 60% of the entire tropical peat carbon pool. So it's kind of a hotspot for carbon accumulation. Oh. And tropical peat swamp forests are predominantly what we find in these peatland environments. These are just some photos taken from the field. So an orangutans, their habitats are tropical peat swamp forests. Their name actually means man of the forest, orangutan. So this is where they are found. We also find other really amazing species. One of them is a proboscis monkey. You find them there. And then this little guy in the middle, it's kind of annoying because it would be really lovely to have the photo taken from the other side. But this is a pit viper. They're actually some of the smallest snakes that you can find in tropical peat swamp forest, but they're also the most deadliest. So when I took this photo, I didn't actually want to get too close to it. So I am kind of glad that I'm standing on this side rather than the other side. But their uses in Southeast Asia are slightly different to the UK. So around 50% of our tropical peat swamp forests within this region are now covered by managed land. And that has mainly been used for palm oil and growing these palm oil plantations. And this is driven by our global demand in vegetable oil. So I'm pretty sure every single one of us this morning will have consumed or used something with palm oil in it. It used to be more visible on an ingredients list. You used to be able to see palm oil, but now it's kind of branded under vegetable oil. So it's not always easy to see exactly what products contain palm oil. But if it says vegetable oil, I'm pretty like 99% sure it will probably be palm oil. And palm oil is very important because it's able to bulk out our raw products so we can use less of the raw product and that keeps prices cheaper. It's also colorless and odorless as well. So when it comes to thinking about alternatives, that's quite limited. It also has a very high yield, so less land is needed to grow a large amount of it. But linking back to the fundamental concept that peatlands are swamps, it means that when it comes to growing things on them, they need a lot of human modification to turn what is a swamp into something that you can actually grow anything on, really. And that requires a lot of deforestation. But the main component of that is drainage, because you have to keep draining the land to ensure that it doesn't become waterlogged. So this is a map of one of the oil palm plantations that I used to work on. And you can see that has kind of a gridded structure to it. These are all the drains that are put into these systems to continuously flush water out of these peatlands as quickly as possible. They are so big, in fact, that this is just taken from Google Maps that I took a few weeks ago. If you go onto Google Maps and you go to Borneo, you can actually see in the land where all of your peatland oil palm plantations are. So anything on the map with like a gridded structure all around here will be your peatland oil palm plantations. They're very visible from satellite imagery. This has big consequences for our climate because linking back to how peatlands are formed, they need waterlogged conditions, and the water table in a peatland is high for the majority of the year. So you would normally have to wade through a tropical peat swamp forest. The water would kind of be up to your waist most of the time. But to obviously make them suitable for agriculture, you need to drain them. And in doing so, you change the dynamics of the system completely. So where you did have a large amount of anoxic peat, you kind of reverse this. So your previously saturated peat layers are suddenly exposed to oxygen. And those microbial communities and organisms that have been living in the peat suddenly get a fresh amount of oxygen and loads of organic matter. So loads of food that's readily available for them to kind of eat away, basically. And because of this, huge amounts of carbon are released into the atmosphere. In terms of tropical peatland and thinking about how long it takes for a peatland to form, so as I said, 1,000 years for just a meter of peat to form. We're able to actually lose 5 centimeters of peat a year in the tropics because of how warm the conditions are. So this is just a basic schematic to kind of illustrate where all those different carbon fluxes, I would say, are coming from. So we've got carbon dioxide coming out of that, methane, which is another big thing that comes out of that too. And because of this, degraded peatlands, if we tot up their carbon emissions worldwide, they represent 5% of human-induced greenhouse gas emissions, which is a huge amount of carbon that's released every year just from these degraded landscapes. Some of you might argue that they're swamps and they are associated with having high methane emissions. If you've ever kind of sat on a peatland, I don't know if anyone's done that, but you'll see these like bubbles coming up, which are ablution events, which is your methane basically being emitted. Yes, they do release methane, but an intact peatland has that like layer of vegetation above it, and that vegetation resequesters all of that carbon that has been released. So it balances out to be a huge carbon sink. But by draining and degrading your peatland, you remove all of that. And it means that your carbon has nowhere else to go to other than into the atmosphere. Not only are these large emitters of carbon, but because the peat actually physically gets eaten away, basically, by the microbial communities at a rate in the tropics of 5 centimeters per year, slightly less in temperate regions because we have colder climates. It means that at the end of a 25-year cycle, your peatland oil palm plantations, all the peat has basically completely gone, and you're left with just the mineral soil. And that has other implications for things like sea level rise because you're physically lowering the land. And also, you can't do anything with that land once the peat has gone. As I said, it takes 5,000 years for these peatland systems to form in the first place. And the degradation activities that take place also alter the properties of your peat. So it can become hydrophobic, which means that it actually repels water. So it's not so simple as simply just re-wetting sites as well, because also that could release huge amounts of methane. This is hopefully a nice image to show you from the fens what it looks like when you're losing the peat. So the fens is kind of cool because not in a great way, but you find these river systems that are higher than the surrounding landscape. And that's because you've got a peatland that's been drained. And because of that, you've got like rivers that are higher because of the amount of peat that has been lost in a process called subsidence. And the picture on the right is to show you kind of how much peat has been lost over several years. So you can really see where the top of the peat surface used to be, and then after how many years it's kind of lowered itself because that peat's been eaten away and has become carbon dioxide and methane emissions. I'm really interested in the water component, so the carbon that gets lost in the water. I always relate this to a cup of tea. So if you have, I think we all drink tea. If you imagine your tea bag is your peatland and you add your hot water to it, naturally you'll find that your water turns brown because you do leach out a bit of carbon, a bit of organic matter into your surrounding water. But if you degrade and you drain that peatland, it's like ripping open the tea bag. So more and more of that organic matter, so your tea leaves leave your peatland and go into the water system. And because of this, you get this very dark, rich brown water. If you ever look at old maps of Borneo, and even maps today, they all say Blackwater rivers and then with a particular name that signifies that river. Because they are called Blackwater rivers, because the rivers are literally, they look black, hopefully quite visible from these photographs. And I'm interested in then what happens to that carbon basically when it enters the water because it doesn't stay there. If it stayed there, it would represent kind of a translocation of carbon from one store to another, but it doesn't because there's microbial communities that live in our water. They break down that carbon and they release it into the atmosphere as CO2 and methane as well. So this is another, I guess, indirect source of greenhouse gas emissions that come from these systems. So thinking back to peatlands and agriculture, they're so hard to grow on. And this is because of what peat is in the first place. There's a lot of organic matter there and it has a very high acidity. So it needs a lot of things like lime to raise the pH to make it a more hospitable environment. It has a very low fertility. You wouldn't think that when you looked at, say, a tropical peat swamp forest, but that's because the species have specifically adapted to those conditions to grow there. If you grow anything else that isn't adapted, it doesn't like it. So it means that you have to feed it huge amounts of fertilizer, maybe mainly kind of nitrogen fertilizer is one of those. It also has, and what I've written here is a high lateral conductivity. It basically means that water moves through peat very quickly. So if you're thinking about putting all that fertilizer on, you have to put more on because it's going to move out very, very quickly. It also has a very low availability of things like micronutrients as well a hydrophobicity. So if you over dry it, which can very easily happen when you do the conversion process, it actually means that it can't absorb a lot of water. And obviously crops do need water to grow in the first place. At the other end, it also likes to waterlog itself very quickly. So that means that water management is incredibly difficult. It has a very weak load bearing capacity. And this is one of my favorite pictures in terms of oil palm on peat. And it helps to illustrate this point nicely because you probably, I don't know, but a perception that people have of a palm oil tree is like a tall, thin tree. That's exactly right. That's what it should look like. But when you grow it on peat, because peat is basically a sponge, if you ever walk on it, it's like literally walking on a sponge. It means that it cannot support big, tall tree species unless it's adapted to grow there. So what happens is your palm oil trees become kind of short and dumpy. They also tend to bend as well because the peat's constantly moving. So you get these kind of short, bendy oil palm trees as a consequence. So if you ever go to an oil palm plantation on peat, or if you go through Malaysia, for example, you can always identify what palm oil is grown on mineral soil and what palm oil is grown on peatlands because of what the trees look like. And also subsidence is a huge issue. So there's also an increased risk of flooding. So it's definitely a challenge to grow in these systems. Another big problem with agriculture on peatlands and drying them out in the first place is you've suddenly got this huge expanse of very dry organic matter. And what happens when you have hot temperatures is that organic matter will just ignite itself. This is a photo taken in 2015 of the peatland fires that took place in Malaysia and in Indonesia. It was taken at night purely because when peatlands are burning, you can't see it above ground. They mainly burn kind of under the ground. So to kind of see the full extent of that, it has to be quite dark. It means as well, it's incredibly difficult to put these fires out because you can't really see very easily where they're spreading to or where they're going either. 2015, we had huge peatland fires that occurred, but it's something that actually happens every year. And it's happening more frequently because we are degrading more of these peatland sites. They're then being left once they have no use, and therefore they are ripe to ignite and catch on fire. And in 2015, some of the fires per day emitted more carbon emissions than the entire US economy in an entire year. So huge amounts of carbon was emitted, but it also wasn't covered that much at all. Peatland fires in general, I don't think are very much covered by the news. So I'm now really interested, and I thought I'd just share at the end kind of what I'm doing now. I'm really interested in looking at the continuum of carbon. So, how it leaves your terrestrial areas, goes into your freshwater environments, and then where that freshwater ends up, which is in our marine systems. And linking back to the photos of the brown water, if we are degrading our peatlands more, it means that we are emitting more carbon into the water, and that's browning it even further. And that has big consequences for freshwater dynamics, but also our marine systems, particularly our coral reef systems. So, this is some work that we have ongoing at the moment in Borneo. This is a photo here to show you the brown water from our peatlands actually then mixing with our marine system. So you can see the brown water that's come from the island and is mixing with our marine systems. That obviously has a lot of things like total suspended solids, so lots of carbon bits in there, and it's just darker in general. So what we're doing is we're trying to understand the impact that has on coral reef systems, because Malaysia also is home to the coral reef triangle, which is incredibly important for marine life. So we're doing a number of different things. This is not me. This is my PhD student Hannah, but she does scuba diving as part of the collection process for water samples. I like to include this photo because I think it's really cool, even though it's not a photo of me. So we're doing a whole combination of field work. We're also looking at remote sensing as well. So because of how dark the water is, it gets picked up on satellite imagery, and we can basically, hopefully, use this to understand what the concentration of carbon is in the water, and using previous historical satellite imagery, calculate how that's changed through time as well, to see how the expanse of oil palm plantations on peat is having on our carbon fluxes. And then she's doing some incredibly clever modeling that I don't know a lot about, but hopefully we'll kind of synthesize this all together. And I wanted to end with a range of different photos that we've taken from the field. So these are just examples of seawater sampling that we do, the different types of equipment that we use. We have this really cool system that allows us to look at water salinity over different kind of depths as well, and you get different profiles, which is very, very cool too. More great pictures of Hannah scuba diving. Also, lots of work that we do on our freshwater environment. So we're basically tracing it down all these different peatland rivers to see how it changes. So it mainly involves collecting lots of different samples on boats, or using a bucket and string method from a very conveniently placed bridge to get to the middle of a river as well. Yeah, this is us. I'm kind of standing. I am actually doing something, but we're kind of again collecting lots of data, pH, concentration of the carbon as well that gets analysed in the lab. More photos of kind of the boats that we were taking out into the different systems. Always like to include this photo because I think when we go and do water sampling, a lot of the locals think that we are quite crazy because the waters are full of crocodiles. So you genuinely have to be really, really careful. We've not actually seen a crocodile, but there are these signs everywhere. And whenever we go near the water, someone wants to kind of tell us basically don't. And you can see the oil palm plantation landscape as well near all the water systems. Just a nice photo that we took. This actually was taken from a local longhouse that we went to. And there is a man, I don't know if you can see him, but he's underneath that, ironically, oil palm tree on a motorbike. His full-time job is to make sure that crocodiles don't come into the community, basically. So he thought we were completely crazy when we were taking water samples, but agreed to like look out for crocodiles from us. So I just wanted to kind of end on the last two slides with talking about what this all means in terms of our peatlands. So because we have to continuously drain peatlands, it means that unlike other forms of agriculture, for example, deforestation for, grazing of cattle in the Amazon, which is a huge problem, that just represents a one-off carbon cost, though. But when it comes to peatland environments, the carbon emissions are continuous. It's not just one-off. It's over the entire life cycle of that agricultural system and beyond, basically. And that's why it carries with it such a large greenhouse gas emission when we look at it on a global scale. So this does mean that we have this kind of options. We've got three different options here when it comes to thinking about how we want to manage our peatlands, but also how we need to be realistic about these sites too. So the first option is to conserve these systems, so protecting them from conversion, fire, and logging, which obviously represents a brilliant option, but in today's world, it isn't very realistic. So actually, that only leaves us with kind of two options that we should really be focusing on. The first is mitigating. So this is how we can understand these systems more to look at how we can manipulate the water table level to keep it as high as possible for as much to grow. And that's really a balance between how high you can have the water table and what impact that has on your yield. But this is probably the most realistic because it's balancing livelihoods with emissions. A lot of the work I do is in Malaysia, and the oil palm industry makes up 80% of the economy. So, in terms of conserving, that's not really a very realistic option. Also, here in the UK, we also need, again, like I said, 40% of our vegetables come from peatlands, and it is a very valuable crop that we grow on them. So, we have to really think about how we can utilize these areas more. I can't use the word sustainable because they aren't sustainable, but how we can use them better, I guess. The other thing we need to be focusing our efforts on is restoration. So, what actually can we do to these sites once the land is no longer viable? There are lots of questions relating to this. There's a lot of research that doesn't have answers to this at the moment. A lot of the options we do at the moment is just simply blocking the drains that we used to originally drain the land in the first place and let the kind of water tables naturally like equipolate, but also we can't add too much water to the site because that would mean that we get huge amounts of methane released in the process of flooding the land. And we don't yet know how long it takes for a peatland to go from a carbon sink, a carbon source back to a carbon sink. We don't have those. We don't have those answers yet. So that does require kind of a lot of long-term monitoring and understanding how these systems work. And then also things like climate change that also will continue to mean that we need to monitor these sites and understand how they're going to change with warmer temperatures and how even the little microbes that live in them will adapt to different conditions as well.